Holy Spirit to be with us as we study your holy teaching, what you have revealed to us, the grace that you have given us to live Christian lives. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. St. Thomas Aquinas,
pray for us.
Pray for us. So how many of you were here for at least part of the series that we did in October, just by show of hands? About half, maybe a little more than half. Okay, good. Well, we'll do a very brief review. It's not, I know some people asked me, they thought, oh, I don't need to come because it sounds like the same subject, it's the same material. So the last series was called How to Be Happy, right? Okay, How to Be Happy. And this series I've entitled The Good Life. So they're related, but not the same material. We're going to be going a little bit deeper, but if you weren't here for the first series, I trust you won't be lost. This is a good jumping on point. The other thing I'll say about this series, as opposed to the last one, for those of you who were here, is that I know that in the last series we got a little bit deep into the weeds of philosophy. Those of you who were here, is that right? You felt stretched a little bit? Okay. So I promise this will be more practical, okay? More practical. Now that's not to say it's not going to be philosophical, because it definitely is. And especially tonight. But I promise tonight will be the most philosophical, and we're going to then get into more application. So I promise that through the course of this series, you will definitely come away with more ideas of something that you can use in your daily life. The difference between substance and accidents, you may not use in a day-to-day. Okay, I understand. Let's see. So, by way of review then, just briefly, we talked in October about what is happiness. Does anybody want to offer a reflection on that? Do you remember? I mean, we spent 4 weeks talking about happiness. What can we say? Anybody want to be bold and say anything about happiness?
The absence of sadness.
The absence of sadness. That's included. You weren't here, though. Okay, no. But that's a very good guess. So happiness, just as a little refresher, happiness is what everyone wants. Happiness is found when a thing reaches its natural purpose or goal, its end. Now, end not in the sense of beginning and end, but end in terms of goal or purpose or finish line. So when a thing does what it's supposed to do, it reaches its fulfillment, that's where everything can find its happiness, okay? So everything is striving, in a certain sense, for happiness by fulfilling its nature, by being really what it is. So, we talked about these guys. Okay, so for the brave little toaster, for him to be happy as a toaster, he has to know what he is, namely that he is a toaster. And so his happiness is going to be in his fulfillment of being a toaster. If the brave little toaster tries instead to be a vacuum cleaner, he's not going to find happiness and fulfillment, because he's trying to do something that he's not really made to do. So happiness is found in the fulfillment of our purpose, the fulfillment of our nature. So that is, in a brief word, what happiness is. So remember, we went over these questions again and again and again, that we want to know the purpose of something, or what it is for something to be good. How do I know that a chair, for instance, is good? We say a chair is good. Well, what makes it good? What are the qualities you would want in a chair? It should be comfortable. What else? And it should be sturdy, right? So if you sit in a chair and it falls apart, is that a good chair? No. And how do we know that? That's not just my opinion that it's not a good chair. It's not a good chair because chairs are for sitting in. So in order to judge, is this good or not, I have to know what is it and what is it for. Those are the two questions that we're always asking. Whenever we ask if something good, you have to know two things first. First, you have to know what it is and what is it for. Same thing with a clock. Okay, so what are clocks? What makes a clock a good clock? Welcome. It tells the time because that's what clocks are for. Now, if a clock is not sturdy to sit on, or it's not comfortable to sit on, does that make it a bad clock?
No.
No, because that's not what clocks are for, okay? So we judge the goodness of a clock or the goodness of a chair or whatever by fulfilling its purpose. So in order to know, is this clock a good clock? Well, first I have to know what is it and what is it for? And that's how we can arrive at the idea of goodness, purpose, okay? So happiness is found in the fulfillment of one's purpose. So even for ourselves, what do we then have to know? We have to know, what am I? And what are we? Human beings, right? Okay, human beings. We have to know that we're human beings. Yeah, that was a freebie. Okay. And then what is our purpose? And that's what we spent 4 weeks in October talking about our purpose. But tonight we're going to be digging deeper into really practical applications of fulfilling our purpose, arriving at our end, our goal as human beings. Okay. So in light of that, that was our recap. So for those of you who weren't here for 4 weeks, that was a great run-through of the highlights of 4 weeks worth of talks. Welcome. So in light of that then, let's think for a minute about if that's what happiness is and that's what goodness is, then I wonder, what is freedom? Anybody want to offer a definition of freedom? Yeah.
The ability to be able to pursue those things.
Yeah, okay, so to be able to pursue those goals. Yeah, okay. Anybody else, any thoughts on what do we mean by freedom? Or a way I like to frame the question a lot of times, because people don't want to answer, is what do you think other people might mean by freedom? What's a common way of understanding freedom? Yeah.
To not be enslaved.
Yeah, okay, to the opposite of enslavement. Yeah, okay, very good.
Choice.
To have choice, right? Okay. Yeah, Javier.
I think that it's all of that, but it is in a context.
Okay.
So in this case, I'm assuming that you're going to go towards the law of God, right?
Yeah, well, you saw the title of our presentation. Yes. No, of course, you always know when we ask a question like this that hopefully it will subvert your expectations in some way. It shouldn't be obvious. If it was obvious, then we wouldn't be asking the question. So people often have a particular understanding of freedom, but I will put it to you that the way most people understand freedom, perhaps even the way you understand freedom, is not the way the Bible understands freedom. In fact, it's not the way that the ancient world in general understood freedom. So the meaning of the word freedom changed a lot within the last few hundred years. And we could really do, and I would love to do maybe some other time, a whole 4-week series just on the idea of freedom, because it really is so important. But for now, we're just going to start here. So keep in mind that we'll be challenged in some of our thinking, but I think you'll find it helpful. So, St. Thomas Aquinas says, man is the master of his actions by 2 things. What are they? Reason and will. So you hear people talk about free will, right? Free will. Well, St. Thomas Aquinas, sometimes he's translated as talking about free will, but really free choice is a better word, because free choice is an action that comes from both the reason and the will. So freedom is not something that's just in the will, it's in the reason and in the willing together. And we'll explain what exactly that means. So he says, man is the master of his actions by reason and will. Thus, free choice is said to be a faculty of the will and of reason. Okay, what do we mean by that? Reason, or we might say intellect, is that ability. Now, we talked about this in the first series too, so let's see how much you remember. Our intellect is that power, that higher power of our soul that allows us to grasp ideas in the abstract. Okay, so all the other animals have a basic kind of intelligence, but what we mean here by reason is that higher order level of thinking, where we can perceive something not just on its material basis, but in the abstract. I can have an idea of something in my mind. I can think not just about this person or that person, but I can think, what is it to be a person? I can think about persons in general without thinking about a particular person. So that's the kind of abstract, higher level thinking that distinguishes us from other animals, and that's what we mean by reason. So I perceive certain goods in my mind that go beyond simply what I sense with my five senses. The will, then, is an appetite. The will is like a magnet. The will draws us to those goods that are perceived in the intellect. So rational goods are desired by the will. Let me give you a very simple example, because we all have appetites, lower appetites like we share with other animals. So, for instance, if you put, if you put a steak in front of a hungry dog, all things being equal, right, unless you have conditioned it in some other way, the hungry dog is going to eat the food. He has an appetite, and so he moves instinctively towards it. So a dog wouldn't, for instance, do what we do during Lent, fasting. To say, oh, here's something that's good to eat. I'm hungry. I would like to eat it. I have an appetite for it. But we fast because we recognize that there's some higher good. So we have some other reason, a spiritual good, or even abstract health. So the dog is not thinking, oh, this food is healthy, that food's not healthy. No, they move by natural attractions, right? But we, by our reason, can pursue higher level goods that go beyond just the sensible goods, the goods of our senses, touch and taste and sight and so forth. Okay? So freedom, therefore, is something that proceeds from the reason and the will. When I perceive something as good, and therefore my will is drawn towards those rational goods, not merely the sensible goods. Okay? So the dog goes after the food, but that is not, in this sense, really an expression of free choice. It's not to say that anything was forcing the dog, so he is free in that general sense of he's not being coerced, but it's not a free choice the way that we're using it here. Freedom being a rational choice. He eats it because he's hungry. He's not deliberating about it, right? Okay. So that's in a general sense what we mean by freedom. So, Thomas continues. He says, since the will concerns the good, or at least the appearance of good. Now that's an important qualification, because sometimes we choose things because they're good, but maybe they're not really good. But they appear to us as good. And if they didn't appear to us as good, we wouldn't choose them, right? So whatever we choose because at the time, it seems like a good thing. Even if we know, for instance, we know that it's wrong, we know that it's not the thing we're supposed to do, we're still choosing it because there's something about it that seems good to us, right? So we choose things because they are good, or at least because they appear good. So since the will concerns the good, or at least the appearance of good, the will is never moved into evil unless that which is not good in some way appears to have the character of good. Consequently, the will never tends into evil apart from some ignorance or error of reason. Does that make sense? So whenever we choose, so the will is always drawn towards good things, right? But sometimes we move towards things that appear to us as good, but are not really good. And that is what he talks about as tending towards evil. So we might choose something that we think is good, but is actually not good. But if we're doing that, Thomas is saying, that's only possible because we've made some kind of error in our judgment. That if we really totally saw what was truly good for us and what wasn't, we wouldn't choose the evil, right? We choose the evil because we've made an error in judgment. Yeah, Javier.
I have a question. Isn't this, is there some relative, let's say different cultures, right, that may have a different standard of morality, for example, right? So what happens in those with an example, let's say just culture A, culture B, right? Culture C, and we are culture A, and we have a standard of morality that comes from this. But what happens when you have, in other words, isn't freedom relative in that aspect, that they could consider freedom, or is this an absolute? that we say, no, 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 freedom is this definition of freedom regardless of morality in different cultures, for example.
Yeah, well, okay, so part of it is based on a certain objectivity of moral expectations. Now, it's possible that a whole culture could have a particular moral judgment in which all of the people from the time they're children are taught that stealing is not wrong, or murder is not wrong. Human life has no intrinsic value. And so we're just kind of raised in that culture of, yeah, when you're mad at somebody, you kill them. Not a big deal, okay? So that would be a wrong moral judgment. And so even though a child maybe is raised in that environment and therefore has very little opportunity to think differently because that's the whole world that they live in, that's just the way it is, it's still an error it's an ignorance, right? So that individual or maybe even that group is failing to realize that no, actually this is wrong. There's something wrong here. So whenever evil is pursued, another way to put this is that evil is never pursued for its own sake. Whenever we do something evil, even when we know it's evil, it's because of some aspect of good that we're attracted to. Okay? So the will, like I said, the will is a magnet that is always drawn towards what appears to us to be good. Therefore, when it's drawn to evil, that means that our judgment, our perception, something has gone wrong through an ignorance or error, right?
So if I invested in Theranos, I lost my money, but I was an error in judgment.
That's yeah. So making bad investments, it's an error in judgment, right? Okay. Yeah.
I just don't understand that it being that sometimes the will get tempted toward bad, and so even though it's out for itself rather than for what God would want us to be out for, but
Yes.
I just don't understand the comment that will is, and I might be misunderstanding, but that will is always concerned with good. That's what I don't understand.
It is always concerned with good, or as it says here, at least the appearance of good. So for instance, let's go back to that very first sin in the Garden of Eden. What the Bible says there is that when Eve is looking at the fruit, it says she sees that it is good to the eyes and desirable to be eaten, right? So it's beautiful, it's tasty. So actually, there are good things about the fruit that God said not to eat. There is a good there. And so she makes an error in judgment because she takes that good, well, it looks nice, and that judgment outweighs the fact, but God said don't do it, right? So whenever we do the wrong thing, it's because we are misjudging. So because everything has some kind of goodness in it, right? There's no such thing as an act that is purely evil. And I know that seems, so there are things that are objectively and always wrong, like lying. Okay, so lying, we'll talk more about lying another week, but the teaching of the church is lying is always wrong. But that doesn't mean that when a person lies that there is not some good that they are pursuing. That doesn't justify it, but there is some good thing. So for instance, if I know that if I tell the truth about I didn't do my homework, then I'm going to get in trouble. So me not getting in trouble, well, that's a good thing, right? And so I'm lying for the sake of that good. Now, does that outweigh the fact that one shouldn't lie? No, but I am pursuing a good, right? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'm not trying to be.
No. These I'm sure your questions other people have as well.
I just keep thinking of, well, what about people like sex traffickers? How could you possibly extract anything good from that? It's complete exploitation.
Well, of course, it is evil. It is horrifically evil, and that's why I say. I mean, there are all kinds of things that are grossly evil and objectively evil, but they're still pursuing pleasure. They're pursuing money. They're pursuing things that, in and of themselves, are that's what's attracting them. Oh, I want this thing because it's good. They're not doing it because it's bad. Because you're right. I mean, they're doing it because they think it is good to them. It has the appearance of good.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
What happens with Santa?
With what?
Santa?
With Santa.
I don't know. I don't know. Yes.
So take something like the Crusades, where the goal was to help them see the light there, the Muslims versus Christianity is it.
Yeah.
Where does that fall on the continuum, if you will, or is that their intentions were to introduce them to God, even though these were people that were interested in our perception of God? I mean, where does that fall on?
Yeah, I mean, they're pursuing a good. Now, whether it was actually good or an appearance of good, that then is the question of morality. But this is a really helpful thing to keep in mind, because I find one of the things that makes conversation and dialogue really difficult is we have a tendency to think that the people that we disagree with, that they're just evil, and that they just, right, well, people who believe X, like, they just, they have no reason. Well, no, let's stop and think a minute, because everybody's pursuing something that to them seems good, right? So that's not to say that it is good, but in interfacing, it's helpful to think about, okay, well, what is the good that they are trying to achieve? Now, again, that doesn't mean that it is good, but it helps us to understand that from every subjective perspective, everyone is doing something. No one thinks that they're the villain, right? Everyone thinks that they're doing something that's good, even if it's just good for them. Maybe that's their philosophy. Take care of yourself. Well, to them, that's good, right? So it's the appearance of good. Yeah.
Well, so do you mean that, are you implying that there is some absolute good or some measure of, so that somebody who, for example, is good for me because I'm getting money, I can feed my kids, whatever, but it's only an appearance of good versus
Yes.
Who decides what's good and what's the appearance?
That is exactly what all 4 weeks are about. Okay. That's what we're going towards.
Get my bill later.
Yes. So that's what we're working on is precisely that but we sort of answered it at the outset, which is, how do we know that something is good? Well, we have to know what is it and what is it for. But what we're going to do through the course of this series is apply that to very specific categories, right? So lying and murder and the obvious things, but some less obvious things as well. So and also if you're one for controversy, we already are sort of having good questions. Yeah, I'm going to make sure that we try to keep everything peaceful as we go, because I know that when we're talking about morality and social expectations and stuff like that things can be contentious, but they're good and they're important questions. So yeah.
What you're teaching seems to me, like all the controversy about what we are or not teaching in our schools, is what we ought to be teaching kids, to say, even though you make this choice, you still see what you're saying, that there is some good. If you can see that, you have to be saying that to yourself every time you read the news right now.
Yeah. Well, but the other thing that gets back to your comment is that I think we also have to be willing to say that a person is pursuing something that seems to be good to them, but that it's also possible that they're wrong, right? That not everything is actually good for people, right? So the kid who just wants to keep eating candy because they like the taste of candy, well, there's a point at which it's like, okay, I get that this is an apparent good to you, but actually it's come to a point where it's not good for you. And that's independent of their perceptions or feelings. So we also have to be willing to sort of cross that line to say, okay, yes, this is an apparent good to you, but actually it is not actually good for you. So that we're going to tease out how can we make those types of judgments. Okay, so let's say we're on a game show and you're about to win a prize, but the prize is not assigned. You have to pick 1, 2, or 3, and your prize is behind that door. So Ryan, which door do you want to choose?
Go with number 1.
Number 1. Okay, so unfortunately behind door number 1 is a tiger who comes out and eats you.
Oh.
Okay, so that was his prize, so he's dead. Now, in that choice, the choice that Ryan just made of door number 1, was it a free choice?
Yes.
I mean, in the sense of no one compelled him to pick number 1, so he was unconstrained. But did he choose the tiger? Well, yes and no, right? he didn't really know the consequence of the choice, right? So it wasn't entirely free. Had he known that the $1 million was behind door number 2, he wouldn't have chosen door number 1, right? So he made, out of ignorance, he made a particular choice. And so therefore, we might say that he was lacking in a certain kind of freedom, because if he was totally free in his choice, he would have the options before him, and then he would really say, okay, do I want $1 million or do I want to be eaten by a tiger, right? So having that knowledge of the choices is part really of our expression of our freedom, because knowledge, knowing what we're doing and knowing the consequences, all of that builds out our freedom. So there's again a sort of minimum level of freedom where he wasn't constrained, nobody forced him to, but really in a situation like this, his choice was what we call arbitrary, right? Because he has no reason, he has no idea what's behind any of these, right? So the choice is merely arbitrary. And this is the issue, is that a lot of times the way we talk about freedom in a more modern sense is freedom means this kind of arbitrariness of like, well, I do what I want, right? Well, I pick 1, I can pick 2, and nobody's telling me what to do, therefore I'm free. But see, the classical understanding of freedom would say that, well, it's not total freedom if you don't really know so that you can choose the good, right? Choosing the good is really constitutive of freedom. So that if you know what the options are and you choose the good, that's really an expression of your freedom. So Aquinas again will say, to choose something not ordered to the end, meaning not fulfilling its proper purpose, that is to sin. So that's what we mean by sin, is to choose something that's contrary to its purpose, to misuse something or ourselves. It evinces a defect of freedom, right? So if we were truly and totally free, we wouldn't choose sin, because as we said before, whenever we sin, we're always making some kind of error, or it's some kind of ignorance or error of judgment. So the more freedom we have, that means the less likely we are to sin, which is you notice that's very different than the way it's often talked about. Because we often think about freedom as just being this middle point between good and evil, and here's my freedom in between, and I'm free. I'm free to do good, or I'm free to do evil. That's my freedom. But freedom, see, in this fullest sense is, well, why would I choose evil? Well, I would only choose the tiger instead of the $1 million if it's behind the door and I don't know which one it is. And therefore, that's a restriction, actually, of the full use of my freedom. So, as he says here, the angels who cannot sin enjoy greater freedom of choice than do we who can. Okay? So we are more free the more we are inclined towards the good. That's really our freedom, because every time we sin, we turn away from the good. That's only there because we have some kind of obstruction. Therefore, our freedom is actually limited in our sin. And you see, that's a very different way of thinking about it, but I hope that that's helpful. An example, and then we'll come to you, would be like addiction, right? So an alcoholic can choose to drink or not drink. But the recovering alcoholic expresses his freedom in choosing not to drink. That's his freedom. He has the choice to drink or not to drink, but one choice is an expression of unfreedom, and the other is an expression of freedom. So that's how we have to think about true freedom, is it's not just, well, I can do what I want. Well, yes, but there are certain actions that are, as we said at the outset, that are enslaving. Those are not actually good things. And so true freedom is this capacity to pursue the good. Did you still have a question?
Yeah, just about the nature of temptation.
Yeah.
So if we are headed in the right direction and we encounter temptation, would we say that the temptation is also directing us toward good?
Yeah, temptations basically work by distorting or disordering the good, okay? So that's why we say that there are a lot of goods out there, and even the classic example that the Bible gives us, the sort of that primordial case of what is temptation, with the tree. The Bible names several good things about the tree, and that's the point, is that in evil, there's always apparent goods, right? There are goods to be had, but we take those goods and we weigh them as more important than the things that are actually more important. So temptation always gets us to take the good things out of order, right? That's really the nature of evil, is that we're pursuing a good, but we're pursuing it in a disordered way.
And it's in a way distortion from what is good, but appearing as good.
Yeah, because if I think that the good taste of the apple is a better good than the good of obeying God, well, I've made an error in judgment, because that's not actually true. And so there are consequences to that. But it's an error that leads us to make that decision.
In this sense, can the temptation be seen as the door in your example?
Yeah, well, that's what the devil does, is the devil veils things, or not even just the devil. The Bible also talks about the flesh. So we have our appetites, our lower appetites, draw us towards certain goods. And so we have this war between ourselves of a rational good, of, well, I know, as Paul says, I know the good I ought to do, but I end up doing something else. Well, why? Because we have these competing passions, right? We have the lower appetites, and we have our will, and they're in conflict with each other. So sometimes we fall into temptation, not just because of the devil, but just our own. We have a kind of disordered passion. So good. I want to keep. Okay, one more question. You haven't spoken yet. Go ahead.
Brother Anthony,
Yes.
the Holy Ghost is going to lead us in all truth.
Yes.
That's also going to direct our steps, but we can override the Holy Ghost real easy because of the sin nature of man. So, what's his name? Richard Thomas Aquinas?
Yes.
So, historically, he came after the Apostle Paul, right?
Yes. Much later. Yeah.
So, we can see Apostle Paul's writing appearing in this setting right here as far as what I like to do, I shouldn't do it. What I shouldn't do, I do it.
Yeah.
Well, it's basically, you got two dogs in war.
Yeah.
The one you feed the most is going to win, you know?
That's exactly right. But I think what Paul's getting at there is that when he says, I know the good I want to do, but I don't do it, that's precisely what we mean by he's not really being free, right? When we're free, we do the good. That's really an expression of our total freedom. So we'll keep going. So this is Leo the 13th. This is perhaps one of my... this is my favorite pope. It's hard to have a favorite pope, but Leo the 13th is just absolutely incredible. And he has this text called Libertas. I highly recommend it to you. If there's any homework for the week, it's to read Libertas. Okay, he lays all of this just absolutely brilliantly. And by the way, a little trivia: Leo the 13th is the oldest. How to say this exactly? He's the oldest person to ever appear on film. So he appeared on film in 1896. So you can go on YouTube and find a video of Leo the 13th. It's funny because he's kind of sitting there and they sort of have to tell him, like, wave. Because it's not just a photograph, right? You can move. So he's just sitting there waving like this. But he was born in 1810, making him the person farthest back in history that has appeared on film. Does that make sense? Okay. Anyway, he's also a wonderful pope, a very holy man. The St. Michael prayer, so St. Michael prayer comes from Leo the 13th. A lot of other wonderful things. I love Leo. Okay. Rerum Novarum is Leo the 13th, exactly.
It's sort of like the founder of Catholic social.
Exactly. Okay. This is sort of falling under Aquinas 101, but we could also call it Leo the 13th 101. We're going to get a lot of Leo the next few weeks. Okay. So he says, many there are who follow in the footsteps of Lucifer and adopt as their own rebellious cry, I will not serve, and consequently substitute for true liberty what is sheer and most foolish license. See, so the motto of Lucifer is, I will not serve. I can do what I want. And that is often perceived to be liberty. That's freedom. Freedom is, I can do what I want. And Leo is saying, no, that's what Lucifer is proposing as freedom. But really, we should call that sheer and most foolish license. It's not real freedom, because freedom is ordered towards the good. Saying, I can do what I want. Well, if you do contrary to what is your good, it's self-destructive. And that's what comes out. So John Paul II, obviously, if I had a second, maybe it's so he draws our attention particularly to Leo XIII. A lot of his social teaching keeps pointing us back to Leo. He's just sort of bringing it into a more modern context. And he says here, particular mention must be made of the encyclical Libertas, which called attention to the essential bond between human freedom and truth, so that freedom, which refused to be bound to the truth, would fall into arbitrariness and end up submitting itself to the vilest of passions, to the point of self-destruction. Indeed, what is the origin of all the evils, if not a kind of freedom which cuts itself off from the truth about man? So a very powerful way of putting it, but that's what's at stake. So that's why in this whole discussion of morality, which we'll be doing for the next 3 weeks now, I really want to establish clearly this idea of what is freedom. Because the root, as he says, the origin of all the evils is this false idea of freedom of, hey, I can just do whatever I want, and that's going to be my freedom, which is, as he says, it's freedom that's cut off from truth. And freedom that's cut off from truth is self-destructive. An example, some of you have heard me say this before, but how does a plant receive its nourishment? How does it live and grow? It has roots in the ground, right? So it's drawing up nutrients that way.
Sunshine.
And sunshine. It can convert the light into its nutrients, right? So it lives off of light. That sounds pretty good. I think maybe as an expression of my freedom, I'm going to live like that. I'm going to live my life through photosynthesis, right? So I don't need to eat anymore. I'm just going to absorb the light because I can do what I want. See, this is what John Paul means about being self-destructive. Yeah, you can say that. You can do what you want, but you're not free to do that because your nature is limited in that way. That's not what human beings do. And what are we again? Human beings, right? We're not plants. We're not plants. Therefore, the way we receive nutrition is different than they do. So in order for us to be free, we can't just say, well, you know what, instead of eating today, I'm just going to photosynthesize. No, that's not a choice that you have. I mean, you can try, but again, it's freedom cut off from truth. The truth about who you are is ultimately self-destructive, right? Self-destructive. Okay, and the Lord himself, says it the most clearly. Whoever sins is a slave to sin. So sin is never an expression of our freedom. Sin is a showing of our lack of freedom. Whoever sins is a slave to sin. So when we are truly free, we're pursuing the true good. And to the extent that we pursue these false goods is the extent to which we are not truly free. Okay? How are we doing on time? All right. I think we might make it. Okay. For the one who said, you shall not commit adultery. And where have we heard that before? Where does that come from? The Ten Commandments. Okay. So the one who said, you shall not commit adultery also said, you shall not murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but if you murder, you become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty. You see why the Ten Commandments can be described as a law of liberty, because it's actually showing us this is what your freedom will really look like. Now, we have a tendency to think of law and freedom as being opposed to each other, because freedom is I can do what I want, and law tells you, no, you can't do that. But real freedom is expressed precisely in living in accordance with a law, what we call the natural law. So that's what we're going to talk about in the time that we have left. I have two goals. So just so you know where we're going, we had a great conversation about freedom. I think we're all feeling pretty good about that. I see some nodding heads. So we're going to move forward. We've got 20 minutes left, and I want to accomplish two things, okay? Number one is we're going to do a quick tour into what does the word law mean? What is a law? And the other thing, before we go, my gift to you is that before you leave tonight, all of you will be able to tell me what are the 10 Commandments and in which order. Okay? You laugh, you watch. In 20 minutes, you'll all know it. That's your money back. Okay? All right. So what is the law? What is the law? Anybody want to offer a definition for law?
Code of conduct could be considered.
Okay, code of conduct, telling somebody what to do, how we ought to behave. Any other ideas?
The path to ultimate goodness, freedom.
Oh, she's way ahead. It's the path to ultimate goodness. That's true. That's true. Okay.
Rules agreed upon and governed by people.
Yeah. Okay. So governed by people. So there's a human dimension to law. Sometimes, maybe. Yeah.
It's a rule when you don't follow it, the lawgiver will enact justice on it in some way.
Yeah, there are consequences for a law, right? Okay, good. All right, so Thomas Aquinas actually has this great treatment. Aquinas is just amazing. So, but he has this very concise definition of law, and it has 4 points, okay? So here are the 4 things that constitute a law. Ready? Number 1, it's an ordinance of reason, okay? So now we'll talk afterwards about bad law, because Aquinas is not saying that all laws are good laws, but law in its ideal form is an ordinance of reason, meaning it should, just like we're talking about the goodness, is that it needs to be ordered towards a real good. So it can't just be arbitrary, and it can't be self-destructive. So it's an ordinance of reason, okay? So it has to be based in truth. So it's an ordinance of reason for the common good, okay? Now we'll talk in a second about what is the common good, but essentially what that means is that a law is something that applies to a group of people, and it's for the good of the whole group. And that laws, or ideally, a law is not something that is intended to benefit a private individual, okay? So you might receive personal instructions from your parents to say, you need to do this, but that's not a law. Might be an instruction or even a commandment or something like that, but it's not a law. A law is something that applies to a group, and it's for the good of the group. Okay? So it's an ordinance or reason for the common good made by legitimate authority. Okay? So it's not just any old person can make a law. I don't have the authority to make laws for you or for anyone else, because I don't have that authority. Okay? So made by a legitimate authority and promulgated, meaning that it is published, it's knowable to the people. If the government makes some kind of secret law and they never tell anybody about it, well, it doesn't have the effect of law. So laws have to be promulgated. So this is the Summa question 90 of the first of the second part. So a quick word about the common good. Thomas says this: the first principle in practical matters is the last end. Right? It's the goal, with the purpose of a thing. And the last end of human life is bliss or happiness. There we go. That was our last series. Consequently, the law must needs regard principally the relationship to happiness. Okay? So if the law is there to direct us towards our final goal, and our final goal is happiness, then the law needs to direct us towards happiness. And since one man is part of a community, the law must regard properly the relationship to universal happiness. This universal happiness is, again, what we sometimes call the common good. So the common good is, again, not just my personal good, but is the good that we share. Now, a common good, again, is not opposed to a personal good, but my personal good is actually found in the common good. So, for instance, if I'm a good person, and I don't murder, and I don't steal, and I don't lie, well, that's good for me, but my happiness also depends on the fact that none of you murder or lie or steal, right? So my goodness is actually tied up in the whole community. So if I'm the only good person, my happiness does not actually arrive at where it needs to be. So we can't just always be thinking about, well, just, people, personally, I'm not going to lie, but if everybody else wants to lie, that's fine. Well, no, that's not good because my good is caught up in your good, right? So we have to be in this together. So my happiness and your happiness are actually tied together. And that's what we mean by the common good. Okay, so let's go back to these 4 points real quick. And just think about what happens if one of these is missing. Okay? So if there is a law made by a legitimate authority, but it is contrary to reason, or it's not for the common good, then is it a law? Not in the fullest sense. So Thomas actually says that if any of these are lacking, it is an unjust law, contrary to the human good, or contrary to divine law. And he says, quote, such are acts of violence rather than laws. Because as Augustine says, an unjust law is no law at all. Okay? So an unjust law is no law at all. Because if it's not made by a legitimate authority, if it's not truly for the common good, if it's not an ordinance of reason, or if it's not promulgated, it doesn't really have the true force of law. Now, Thomas also makes a distinction that for the sake of peace, we ought to still abide by unjust laws for the sake of peace, so long as they don't violate the divine law, okay? So if the law is not commanding you to do something sinful, something against your conscience or evil, for the sake of it, if the speed limit, you think, this is not an ordinance of reason. Well, okay, you still, even if it's not an ordinance of reason, you still ought to abide by it for the sake of the common good. Okay, so that doesn't mean you get this free ticket to say, I do what I want. But if the law, the human law, is telling you to do something contrary to God's law, then, as the Bible says, we ought to obey God rather than man. Okay, so that's the distinction. Ken, did you have anything?
I was just going to say that's the basis for Christian civil disobedience.
Absolutely. So that tradition of resisting tyranny exactly goes right back to Thomas. That an unjust law is no law at all, and in fact they are acts of violence. Okay, so an unjust law is an act of violence. All right. So are there different laws? Yes, there are 4 different types of law, and this will bleed over into our conversation next week. But there are 4 types of law. The first is what Aquinas calls the eternal law. If a law is an ordinance of reason, then really all law begins in God, because God, for Aquinas, is reason itself. Okay? So what we mean by the eternal law is that truth about reality that is in God. Okay? So God himself is the eternal law. So this is just the facts of reality as they exist in God. That's what he calls the eternal law. But from the eternal law, we can derive what is called the natural law. Now, the natural law, he says, is the eternal law as it is in the mind of a rational creature. Okay? So as we are able to understand the reality of the way God has made the world, that's what we mean by that's what we mean by a natural law. So St. Paul gives this example. He says, when Gentiles who do not possess the law, meaning like the revealed law given to the Israelites, they don't possess the law, but they do instinctively what the law requires. These, though not having the law, are a law to themselves. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, to which their own conscience also bears witness. So this is the natural law. Okay? So that by virtue of being a human being, through the exercise of our reason, we can arrive at basic moral truths. We don't need special revelation. So sometimes you get these criticisms of like, God makes the 10 Commandments say don't kill. Well, do you really need God to tell you not to kill? Well, actually, Paul says no. Right? You can figure that out on your own. God doesn't have to give a special revelation to say that killing is bad for the common good. Okay? So that's what we mean by the natural law, is reason's ability to look at what is a thing, what is it for, therefore putting these things together is not good. Okay? So that's the natural law. The natural law is the eternal law as it is written into the mind of and the hearts of humanity. Okay? So there's eternal law, natural law, but then there's human law. Because we come to these basic moral principles naturally, but then those principles need to be applied in concrete situations. We need, so for example, in human law, we make a distinction between degrees of murder. Okay? So we know that killing is wrong, but actually through human law, we make more specific applications of, well, there are different circumstances that are more or less severe. All of it is wrong, but in human law, we're now going to, in our particular context, make more specific determinations of how we're going to treat something like that. Another example would be like speed limits. So by virtue of the natural law, we can use our reason to say, well, we ought to drive in a way that is safe and responsible and is not putting other people in danger. The natural law can tell us that. But the natural law doesn't give us a number, right? So a human law has to come in and say, okay, we're going to set the speed limit at 55. It could be 65, it could be 45, but the human law is going to set it at 55 because, well, we need something, right? For the sake of the flow of traffic, we're going to say traffic needs to stay to the right or to the left. Now, it could be either way, but the human law has to determine those things for the sake of the common good, because if not, we get people running into each other, okay? So that's part of the necessity of human law. Same thing then with the application of punishments. We know that stealing is wrong, but, well, what's the punishment for stealing? Well, that's going to differ from context to context. So the legitimate human authority will set what is a proper punishment for particular crimes. So we have the natural law, which gives us the basic principles, but then those principles become concrete in the application of human law. So from the precepts of the natural law, human reason needs to proceed to the more particular determinations of certain matters. So that's what Aquinas says. Finally, then, we come to the divine law. So the divine law, then, is God's revealed law. For instance, what we see in Scripture, the Ten Commandments, the law given to the Israelites, is a divine law. It's revealed. Now, why do we need God? Why does he reveal a law if we already have the natural law? Aquinas gives 3 reasons. One is because God has a goal for us that surpasses natural happiness. So naturally, we can know good and bad in a very basic sense, but God has an even higher goal for us, so the divine law teaches us an even better way. Number 2, because human reason is faulty. So sometimes, as we said at the beginning, we can make errors of judgment. So human laws are not always good laws. So even though we can, in principle, know what's right and wrong, sometimes we make mistakes. So the divine law, the revealed law, helps keep us on the right track. And lastly, only God can judge the heart. Meaning human law cannot legislate what you feel, what you think, because that's interior, right? But we can really do wrong in our thoughts and in our hearts. Human beings may not be able to judge that, but God can. So God gives a divine law to speak to our heart, to guide our conscience, even in what we call the internal form. Okay? All right. So we've got 6 minutes. Are you ready? We need to stretch a little bit. 6 minutes. In the next 6 minutes, you will know all 10 commandments in order. All right? You ready? What is the first commandment? So take your finger like this. Everybody, fingers up, fingers up. Okay. So the first commandment is 1. Number 1, there's only one God. Therefore, the first commandment is you shall have no other gods before me. That's commandment number 1. Got it? Commandment number 2 is a V. You see the V there? You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Okay, number 2 is vain. Got it? Number 3, this is a little stretch, but work with me. Turn it around, look at it like this. Okay, you see the letter K there? Yeah, you do. You do. See, there's a straight line, there's that line, there's that. Okay, so it's the letter K. Look at it. It's the letter K for keep holy the Lord's day. Keep holy the Lord's day. That's commandment number 3. Number 4. Okay, that's a salute. We're like this. Honor your father and mother. Honor your father and mother. Got it? Number five. You shall not kill. You shall not kill. Yeah, I know. Don't get us confused. Don't get us confused. Okay. Number six is to get 5 and 1, and you point to your ring finger. You shall not commit adultery. Okay? You shall not commit adultery. That's commandment number 6. All right. Commandment number 6, you shall not commit adultery. Commandment number 7, you've got 5 and 2, and you take and pull those 2 fingers like this. You shall not steal. Okay? You shall not steal. Commandment number 8, now so we're going to switch to 2 hands, so 4 and 4 like this. 4 and 4, because we're going to put them up to our mouths, and we're talking over here, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, okay? You shall not bear false witness. Number 9, this is my favorite one because it makes the least sense. Hopefully this doesn't offend you. Okay, so this is you, 5 fingers. This is your neighbor, and this is your neighbor's wife. Okay? So don't covet your neighbor's wife. Got it? Don't covet your neighbor's wife. And number 10, you've got all 10 fingers, like you're grabbing, you're going to take something. Don't covet your neighbor's goods. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Hey, that's good, right? And you'll never forget that. So next week we'll have a quiz. We'll start off right off the bat. What's the 4th commandment? What's the 8th commandment? You'll know it. Okay. Yeah, we've got 3 minutes. So in those 3 minutes, I'm going to tell you a little bit about next week, but we take that off the screen. Who can tell me what's the 3rd commandment? Keep. What is it? Keep holy the Lord's Day. Okay, yes. What's the 9th commandment?
Wife.
Don't covet your neighbor's wife. There you go. What's the 2nd commandment? Don't take the Lord's name in vain. What's the 6th commandment? Don't commit adultery. See, I was right. Okay. I should have charged something for this class. You've all figured it out. Okay. Next week. Here's our upcoming schedule. Next week, what do you worship? So really, we'll be looking at commandments 1 through 3. That's the first table of the law. What do you worship? And the next 2 weeks, holy family, happy family, and building a better society. So, I'm really looking forward to this. It's going to be great. This is a great start. So bring your friends next week, and we'll keep going. One other announcement is this book. You guys have a copy of it? You bring one with you? Wave it up in the air. Practical Theology by Peter Kreeft. So at the end of this series, these 4 weeks, we are hoping to start something that can be a little more dialogical, where we do some reading together and some discussing. So I want to put this out there as a future thing to keep in mind. So if you want to get this book, that write this down. Okay, so Peter Kreeft's Practical Theology. Start ordering it now so that at the end of this series, we'll maybe continue doing some reading from this book. It's really excellent, and we'll talk more about it in future weeks.
Did you know Pauline's have that? Pauline's books have that?
Oh, no. It is 7:59. Let's close with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, one last thing is, if you're not already on my email list, feel free to come up at the end here. Give me your name. Try to print clearly. You know how that is. Okay. So because one letter wrong in your email address, you're not going to get it. Okay. So your name, your email, and each week I send out the slides from these presentations. I send out some other materials, so videos and things like that will supplemental material will come your way if we get your name and your email up here.